Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So I came back to the US last year on election night, which was fun. And I found the country that I'd left about 8 years earlier riven with a split between people that had taken on a dimension and emotional salience I'd never seen before. And the news of every week and day seemed to have genuinely invaded people's hearts to the extent that most I talked to were genuinely wrestling with a hopelessness and a deep and pervading anger. And the dinners, and not that monks have dinner, but the gatherings of my relatives and extended family I'd attended before as a layman, which had always been vaguely awkward and, filled with occasional arguments and pokes towards one another, had become pretty intense and riven with political difference. So the ability of conflict and a polarized conception of the world to genuinely invade and dominate our mental landscape is not something I think we can underestimate in terms of its power to really influence our well-being. The Buddha gave a discourse in the middle-length discourses, which I recently found and hadn't heard before, but it's Majjhima Nikaya 139, and it's called the Exposition on Non-Conflict. And in it, the Buddha speaks about, I believe, 6 ways of avoiding conflict, in which he talks about how, first of all, one avoids the extremes of sensual indulgence or self-mortification and walks the middle path. Number 2 is one does not speak in praise or dispraise, but rather speaks only Dhamma. The 3rd is one knows what the external pleasure is, in terms of the 5 chords of sensual pleasure, and internal pleasure is. And knowing so, one pursues internal pleasure, namely that of samadhi, or concentration. The 4th is that one utters no covert speech and no overt harsh speech. The 5th is that one does not speak hurriedly, because when one speaks quickly, one's mind becomes agitated, body becomes tired, and one's words are indistinct and hard to understand. And the 6th is speaks hurriedly, hurriedly. I'll come back to the sixth. 5 out of 6 isn't too bad. We can start with that. Oh, one does not insist on one's dialect, but is willing to adjust one's words to the local dialect. And this, the Buddha says, is a state without conflict. So, how we can use these instructions to change our relationship with the world and ourselves and those around us to one that is genuinely caring and not framed by the dichotomies of concept and politics and various other things is important. And I think these are instructions which initially, they interested me because they aren't the usual instructions. You know, we've all listened to discourses on how to develop loving kindness, but these 6 routes to non-conflict seem genuinely unique to me. The first on that the Buddha gives, encouraging the practitioners to not indulge in these streams of sensual gratification or self-mortification, but to pursue the middle path. Initially was a bit difficult for me to understand. I think how one can look at this instruction is to see how we create conflict in ourselves. And just this morning, someone was talking to me about their attempt to practice mindfulness through the course of an entire day, and how by the end of the day they were just exhausted and had tied themselves up into knots somewhat. And this is a pretty common trope among new monastics as well. There's a famous story of Longta Mahabua, a famous teacher in Thailand, who was told by his teacher Ajahn Mun to keep the meditation word Buddha in his mind constantly for 3 or 4 or 5 days, unceasing until he attained deep states of jhana. And so he did, and it worked for him. So most new monks I've met, and myself as well, read this and decide that that sounds like a great idea. And usually we go to our teacher and say, I'm gonna try to do it, Ajahn. And Ajahn Anan looked at me and said, okay, good luck. And you sort of see the progression over the course of 2 or 3 days of the monk getting steadily more miserable, and not being able to sustain it. Because, and Longpo Sumedho has a story of how in his initial years of monastic life, he was trying so hard to just be mindful of every moment and would just routinely stub his toe and trip over things walking down the path because he was trying so hard to be mindful, as opposed to just mindfully walking. So the ability, and in meditation we do this as well so frequently, is our concept of effort is such a brutal and linear intention, flavored by the extreme self-derision and self-hatred that we grow up with as a consumerist culture, and informed by, various conceptions of original sin. So meditators so frequently enter this practice, and the first years or months can be dominated by a constant attempt to crush themselves into some semblance of peace. And the Buddha compares the meditation object to a bird, where if one holds it too tightly, it crushes it and the bird dies. Whereas if one holds it too lightly, then it will fly away. And I think most of us have spent much of our early monastic years or meditative years just crushing bird after bird. And so it takes, and the importance of this is seeing that to understand how we approach our meditation object in this way is genuinely useful, because the path, and I've mentioned this before, features the Buddhist conception of karma and how our minds and realities condition us is a chaotic system. It's extremely complex. And so it features an aspect called scale invariance, which means that patterns manifesting on one level, say at meditation, tend to manifest in larger scale in the same way. It's like a Mandelbrot set, where a small pattern can be found at every level of our lives. So as we see in our meditation how we crush something like the breath, or how we berate ourselves when we move off our supposed meditation object, we see how that same propensity towards aggression and control, in fact, manifests and dominates our relationships, our career, our whole lives. And because of scale invariance, when we steadily gentle our intention on that small level of the heart of meditation, then the alteration and gentling of the pattern on a wider scale of our lives also occurs. And this is why meditation is not some esoteric and abstract practice distanced from our daily well-being. We change these patterns on the smallest level, and the ripples pervade our whole lives. So all this relates back to just saying that it's true that many of us do have these propensities to self-mortification in terms of just how we interact with ourselves, how we interact with our meditation objects. And we don't see it until you begin to practice and watch yourself overshoot again and again and again. I visited Longpo Pasano at the Pacific Hermitage a few weeks ago, and he was reflecting that this path is just one mistake after another, which is comforting. And that's part of the point, is that you see how you overshoot, and eventually you get a feel for when you're tying yourself up into knots around a meditation or an attempt to be mindful, and your effort becomes more refined. You see the dukkha in this and let it go. And that's how you achieve a state without conflict internally. And similarly with sensual desire, seeing in meditation how you spin off into this or that fantasy, or this or that movie you've seen metaphorically in your head again and again, and seeing how that similar leaning towards distraction dominates so much of our lives, how much of our mental space is taken up with thinking about the next thing and ignoring the bright garden we walk in right now. So this is the internal state without conflict. The second of the Buddha's instructions is to avoid disparaging or praising, but to speak only in terms of Dhamma. And this is one of those gems you find in the suttas where you're just astounded at the wisdom contained in these pages, because the Buddha explains in more detail this specific instruction later. And he says that one speaks dispraise and praise when one speaks in terms of individuals, saying one who engages in sensual indulgence engages in suffering and the wrong path. Whereas one speaks in terms of Dhamma when one speaks in terms of states. And the example he gives for this is the state of sensual fever is a state beset with suffering. And for the record, it's not like we all have to give up every sensual indulgence in our lives or pleasure right off the bat, nothing like that. But just that when we speak about the path, speaking in these general terms that that take away the personal bite is very helpful. And if one can begin looking at individuals less and less as entities to be pushed away from or attracted to, and more in terms of the states in them and of the constituents of their minds, then it's a much cooler place to exist. Because frequently we're faced with these dilemmas, say of someone calling, say an old friend, to vent again. And this is something we've had again and again. And there can be a worry that by pulling away from them, that you're hurting them and initiating a conflict which isn't beautiful. But if you look at this person instead as the states inherent in their heart, and see that by indulging in them, allowing them to vent again, or feeding this anger or sadness, whatever it is, that you're feeding a part of them, a state that leads to their suffering. Whereas if you pull back a bit, present a slightly more neutral face, or try to steer them towards something a bit more Dhammic, then what you're feeding in them is something wholesome. At least you're not feeding the bad. And if you pull away from someone and move towards the spiritual path, then even though at some level it can feel like you're distancing yourself from someone, what you are doing is feeding and giving a reference point to a deeper and more significant part of their hearts. And that's the best thing you can do as a friend. And this isn't some abstraction, this is a real thing people face constantly. Someone, here was recently telling me about how in the past few years, or months especially, these relationships she's had in the past with roommates and deep friends had begun to feel less nourishing because she'd sort of continued to practice at a level that was unique to her. And that it was difficult to know how to negotiate those relationships, and there was a loneliness there. And to understand that there are ways of looking at things where if one's moving away and allowing oneself, say, to retreat from the party or the social gathering a little early for the sake of meditation, it's not a disservice to your friendship, but it's the best and most significant gift you can give those friends. And as a monastic, we confront this regularly, initially going forth into robes, many friends and family don't understand. But over time, you see how people don't need another person to go to the movie with or to have a coffee date with. We have enough of that. What people need is some reference point in their lives for someone who has truly dedicated themselves to a goal and a vision and a path which is transcendent of the inevitable disintegration of so much of what we cling to. And then when cancer hits or a loved one dies, then they have someone in their life to reference. And that is a gift that is truly valuable. So thinking in terms of states rather than individuals can help us in this way too. The third thing the Buddha points to is one knows external pleasure, the 5 sense cords, and knows internal pleasure, the 4 jhanas. And knowing these two pursues internal pleasure. And I think in some ways this can be as simple as seeing that we need pleasure and we need security. And if we don't have an internal source of that, then we have no choice, whether we admit it or not, but to seek it externally. And that can be fairly harmless. Watching the last season of whatever people watch these days. Monks aren't good at these references. But I think Game of Thrones was a thing for a while. So, yeah, that. And so fair enough. But the deeper parts of our heart will cling in a more damaging way. And because what they need is more. We do need more, and we lean on those we love in ways that we don't always admit to ourselves. So when the marriage or the spouse goes through a difficult phase, or changes, or ceases to feel towards us quite as we hope they would, then if we are subconsciously relying on them for our sense of security and nourishment and pleasure, then we have no choice but to become angry. And if their views don't align with ours, politically or otherwise, that's when you see how attached you are. And I, during one of the recent Zoom sessions on Wednesday, someone was asking about how one analogy the Buddha gives for the practice as a fortress, he compares the Dhamma teachings to weapons. And he asked why that analogy was made. And my reflection is that the Buddha recognized that the different tools and frameworks we apply to quiet and point and direct and still the mind, the defilements catch on quickly and block those roots. So I think most of us have had the experience of developing some loving kindness meditation, and it works great, and then 2 days later it's completely ineffective. My meditation journals, which I keep, are full of these moments of being like, I finally figured it out. And I just read that like day after day after day. I keep figuring it out because it keeps changing. And so the Buddha noticed this, and he gives us list after list of these different ways to approach things. And when we're working with a real issue, like a real attachment, a real anger, then you'll find that you'll need to rotate through these methods, this arsenal. So one of the most effective or powerful sets of tools he gives, for example, is to deal with anger. And we've spoken about this previously. There's the standards of developing the 4 Brahma Viharas, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, compassion, equanimity. There's the tools he gives us in terms of not bringing someone to mind. There's looking at someone as your teacher when they're being difficult. But there's other ones too. One of the most effective I've found is to look at the 4 bases of clinging that the Buddha gives, the 4 upadana: sensual desire, rites and rituals, self-view, and views. And when I'm angry, if I apply that framework to those and see which one of those bases is being compromised, it really helps me figure out why I'm angry and put it down. So if you're in line at the monastery and a junior monk cuts in front of you, if you want to get monks angry, that's a great way to do it and really test their practice. Am I angry because of sensual desire, because that monk took the donut that I really wanted, which happens? Am I angry because of attachment to rites and rituals? Because how dare he? This is how we do it. He's junior. Am I angry because of self-view? Because of course he doesn't respect me. No one respects me. It's always been like this. Am I angry because of views? I don't quite know how that would fit in. I think it would sort of fit in somewhere there, such as this monk is always like this, And just to parse things out that simply, to get a little more insight into it, is a very powerful tool. And the Buddha's texts are full of these, which is why it's very worth reading the suttas. Ajahn Pia Dhammo recommends reading them 3 times before you ordain. So maybe you all don't have to do that, but reading them 3 times is a good idea. And there's such wisdom hidden. So all this relates through the fact that saying these 4 bases of upadana, clinging, we don't know how much we depend on these external sources of pleasure until they're taken from us. And then suddenly you know. So when we cultivate this internal source of pleasure, the 4 jhanas is what the Buddha references, but I think we can think of it in terms of what the Buddha references as niramisa sukha, spiritual happiness, these internal sources of pleasure such as loving kindness, concentration, purpose, the sense of deep self-worth that comes from a moral life, giving, the bright heart. These are internal sources of happiness which are completely our own. No one can touch them. And if we manage to cultivate that, then over time, naturally our clinging to others is lighter. And people can be as they are, and you can exist with them and genuinely allow them to be that way, which is true love, because it is liberative love, rather than clinging, controlling love, which is not love. So much of this path, it's like our hearts are these flames. And if they're buffeted by sensual desires and entertainment and relationship and conflict, the flame is always sputtering. So much of this path is just having the stability and intention and patience to just hold still long enough to let that flame grow in brightness. And then we find that there's this deep sense of happiness internally. And it's so much of this path can be characterized as replacing the energy of fire with the energy of light. Instead of the clinging of fire, we're cultivating this bright, still, cool happiness. It's a slow burning happiness. And Ajahn Jayasara compares it to having won the lottery. It's like, say someone wins the lottery, maybe they'll still keep their career because it's something to do that's wholesome, but they won't cheat for the sake of that career. They won't become caught up in, gaining position over those around them. They're fine. And that's how we can go through life when we have this internal happiness. We give, we go through the motions, but everything is held lightly. And we give. We have something genuine to offer to others. So this is a state without conflict. Is one knows external pleasures and those dangers. It's fragile and it feeds on others. And then one knows the internal happiness. And one still can go on dinner dates, one can go to the movies, it's fine. Oh, that was nice. Checking. Good? Wow. But one is no longer dependent on those things. The fourth thing the Buddha mentions is one utters no covert speech or overt harsh speech. And I've been reflecting recently with some spiritual friends on just how most of our karma is created through our speech. We think it would be action, but we're just, the lives we live, so much of what we do is how we speak. And there's such room for refinement there. So it's very interesting how, I've mentioned this before, but after a time on the path, the metric of good and bad no longer apply in the same way. Because most of us know to avoid the explicit lie or the, yelling at someone. We might slip occasionally. But more and more, Longpo Pasno has mentioned this, the metric is beautiful and unbeautiful. That's a better guide for us if we've been practicing for a time, because that's relevant. And you know that. So little things that aren't wrong, say like the edge of sarcasm in our voice, the slight moment of derision, the expressing our opinions a little bit too much. All these, we begin to sense the unbeauty, the lack of beauty in them. And you see what real beautiful speech looks like in the individuals around you who are, there just are some people who are really good at this. I had one monastic friend who, he never said a single thing bad about another person that I remember. I think I can say that about him. And his speech was astounding. Monks can keep certain tonics for 7 days, so say dark chocolate. And if you want to get monks a bit agitated, you can cut in front of them in line, or, usually if one monk eats too much of the chocolate or something, there are ways of initiating conflict in the monastery, and that's probably one of them. So I'd slipped, I'd eaten a bit too much of the chocolate. And I remember this monk coming up to me and he's like, I so appreciated that you did that. I know that you know that I have a problem with my greed, and I know that you're trying to kind of keep me from that sort of, wanting, slipping. And I just really appreciate that. And I was like, yeah, okay. And, to some extent he meant it. So there's these very beautiful ways of speech, and going into a refined culture like Thailand, you become very good, because the Thais and these Eastern cultures that focus on communal harmony are brilliant at this. So for example, in terms of admonishing, there's a general distaste for direct conflict. So I remember in another instance, I was not making Anjali when I accepted the food tray from a senior monk. But he didn't want to tell me explicitly. So what he did was he took me aside after the meal and said, could you tell the monk, my friend monk, who was sitting by me, could you tell him to make Anjali after he takes the tray, because it's polite to do that, but don't tell him that I told you to tell him. And I was like, okay, I'll tell him. But then I realized that this monk was in fact doing that, and that this was this monk's way of making me do it without telling me to do it, which seems a bit convoluted, but it was pretty impressive. And I think there's certainly room for a bit more nuance in how we approach those around us. So that's quite beautiful speech. And there is a place for direct speaking, but there's a time and place. And I think one of the biggest things that we can take on as practitioners is the intention to not gossip. That's big. If you can do that, you have done something that very few people do, and it's an amazing gift. And yeah, I referenced Saint Teresa of Avila, who had the determination to never say anything about another that she wouldn't say in their presence. And we can't always keep that, because there are times where you need to tell someone something about someone. But what you can do is you can set clear borders on that conversation and say, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to say something now that I feel like should be said. And then you say it, and then you stop. And that's worth doing. Because then people really trust you. And if there's that one friend who just loves to gossip, a good defense, the best defense is a good offense. So you can, next time you speak to them, you can say, look, I've done this before and it was pretty effective. Look, I'm trying not to talk about other people behind their backs. Could you help me do that? And they'll be like, okay, sure. It's another little switch, but it works, and then they'll be careful. The fifth means of avoiding conflict is to not speak hurriedly. I have trouble with this one. But I think we can apply it to everything in our lives. I reference a samurai movie I once saw when I was a layman, where one scene from it really stuck with me. And this student comes to his samurai master and the samurai master says, look, let's have a mock battle, would you like to have a match? And the student says, I need to save my strength for something real. And the master responds by saying, look, there are no unimportant or important acts. All acts are equally important. And I slipped up on this, I think we had a live stream or something, or a Zoom session, and there was sort of one person there. And afterwards I commented to my dad. I said, my dad's a practitioner and is quite good about his morality and sense of these things. And I said, I don't think I spoke perfectly, but it was just one person, it was fine. And he said, it does not matter if it's one person or 100, it is always the same. So when you get admonished by your dad for your monastic ethic, happens more often than you would think. But that's the case, is that so often in our lives, it's the little things. Rarely is it the big moments that change everything for us. It's the little conversations. What converted Venerable Sariputta to the path was just seeing Venerable Asiji walking calmly. So how do we slow down in every aspect of our lives and acknowledge that everything from how you do the dishes, to how you sign off on the email, to how you sit carefully taking food, they're all equally important. There's no unimportant acts. Because every act is a source and a vessel for our intention and for shaping that. And that is the quintessential aspect of this path and of our duty as practitioners. The sixth route to non-conflict is one, oh man, did I forget a second time? Who remembers? Anyone? Wait,
Dialect.
Oh, thank you, Allison. Yes, dialect. One does not insist on one's local dialect, but is willing to speak in terms of the dialect of the place one is in. There's more to this than I think meets the ear or eye initially. Reflecting back on that practitioner I had talked about who'd felt herself growing distance from her friends, but these were relationships that couldn't be easily put down. So much of what we can do in that case is it can become a game to find out what someone's Dhamma language is. It takes real skill to ask questions which bring someone to the heart of who they are. But you can usually do it. Almost every conversation has a root to the Dhamma hidden in it. And everyone has that in them. So it's not like you have to insist on these relationships that don't nourish you, but if they're there, if that conversation is happening, then it can really be kind of an interesting game. Like, how skillfully can you, in not too heavy-handed a fashion, can you touch someone's Dhamma? Can you touch their heart? Can you ask questions such as that you can actually make a conversation really meaningful? This requires speaking their language, but it also implies that you're trying to touch into the common language, which is below and above all languages. This is the beauty of gifts, too. If you find yourself in those relationships, one really skillful way of honoring them is to turn them into venues of giving gifts. And this is especially effective in people you're having trouble with, is give them gifts. There's a famous monk who was having trouble with 4 monks at a monastery, I believe, and he made it a habit of spending like a lot of every day with those monks, to the point where his actual friends started getting kind of hurt, so that he could sort of learn to like them. And one doesn't have to do this, but the point being that there's a place for understanding that the gift of food is a language everyone speaks, and it's a dharmic language. So can you just give some cookies to your neighbor or your roommates or whatever it is, you know? How can you sort of touch that? And then there's the simple fact that so much of that conflict that I came back to is based on people taking as the highest what is not the highest. And when you speak in terms of politics, views, then there's room for conflict. But the highest and lowest realms of language, and by that I mean the highest in terms of our aspiration and our potential, and the lowest in terms of our shared experience of dukkha, of suffering. This is the common language which everyone speaks. And how can you find that in a conversation and in a relationship? Because there's always room to connect there. And ironically, that's the most powerful way to initiate change along those other paradigms and strata, is if you come in swinging around a political conversation, people will not usually listen. But if you connect to someone, if you touch their humanity, if you build trust, then you can have a conversation about those other issues. And this is one thing I appreciate so much about Longpo Pasano, is I've almost never heard him say anything someone can disagree with. You know, and it's the role of the Sangha too, is to have some institution in America, apart from Dolly Parton concerts, where people can come together and not be Republican or Democrat or high class or low class, and you're just human. And there needs to be a space like that. It's really healthy for society because it lets people speak and connect, and then genuine change and communication can occur. And we don't all end up walled off in silos of belief. And that's also our role as practitioners, is if you're practicing, you may be someone's only representative of Dhamma in their life that they encounter in many lifetimes. And to compromise that right off the bat with some ill-placed comment of this or that is not excusable. We prioritize what's important, and there's a place for those conversations, but don't forget the value of what you've been given and what you have a duty to uphold and give to others to some extent as you're able. So I'm going to bring this back to my dad once more, is I thought he embodied a state without conflict very well. He was recently at one of these extended family gatherings, and I think a conversation about vaccines came up, which is just a wonderful realm of conflict. And my dad left the conversation, and then he laid down in the middle of the floor with the dog, just sort of laid there. It's a good statement. And I think one of the relatives kind of got it and came over and just hung out with him. And there's a place for conversations about vaccines, but perhaps we can relegate that to its appropriate spot and remember also what our Polaris is, what our North Star is, what our higher order patterning connection is. And that's where we can start the conversation. So, I'm happy that this group has found a place and a space where such connection and community is possible, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. Thank you. So the question for, I think most people heard, but for the iPhone at least, is with the fourth precept, how do we interact with speech which isn't explicit lying, but which is meant to mislead? So the fourth precept is interesting because you do have, there's been attempts throughout history to kind of expand the precepts to include large swaths of activity. For example, I believe Thich Nhat Hanh's communities extend the precept against intoxicants to intoxicating media. Intoxicating media. And similarly, the fourth precept, it's explicitly against lying, but there's the other aspects of wrong speech which are vaguely associated, such as not spreading divisive talebearing, not engaging in coarse, harsh speech, not gossiping, or idle chatter, sampapalapa. It's a fun word. So the issue with that expansion of the precepts is that it changes them from something which is unbreakable to something which you gotta bend sometimes. Like, if the precept against intoxicants is sort of everything that's vaguely intoxicating, it's hard to hold that in a black and white fashion. Like, you're probably gonna watch a movie every now and again. So there's a place for the precepts being the absolute unbreakable lowest denominator in terms of, like, you don't compromise these. And so the one against not lying ever is significant because there is a place for someone knowing that. Because then if your spouse comes to you and asks you, have you cheated on me? And you say no, they know that's true. They know it because, even if someone knows that someone sometimes will use their language in skillful places, they know at some level they can come back to that. They can trust that, and that's really valuable. And what extends from there, though, I mean, yeah, it's a really good point, and I've seen monastics, including myself, fall into this a bit, is, you do bend speech here and there to give certain impressions. And that's when it becomes less an issue of vinaya, the code of conduct, and more an issue of Dhamma, which is extremely relevant. And so, yeah, like Longpo Monindo spoke to me once and he said, look, if you keep bending honesty, not that I was doing it that much, but he's like, if you bend these things, you end up bent. And you can take the 5 precepts all the way to enlightenment. Longpo Tongrat, one of Ajahn Chah's teachers, the practice that Longpo Mun gave to him was to hold the 5 precepts absolutely purely. That was his practice, and that took him to enlightenment. So think of that in body, speech, and mind, etc. So yes, the 4th precept is explicitly against lying, but you're right, like, it was completely appropriate for you to turn down that instance of, manipulation on the app or whatever, and you've got to navigate that, but that's more the realm of Dhamma, because there are also times where it's not skillful to tell someone something, and so that's why Ajahn Jeff frequently speaks about the fact that, like, developing these precepts is a skill. You've got to learn to become skilled at not lying. And that requires being quick on your feet and sometimes preparing. Say you know someone's going to ask you a question and you don't quite know how, like thinking about how you're going to respond beforehand. And yeah, I've seen monastics, there's one monastic who thought that one monastery's meditation hall was like way too much. And one of my monastic friends, Ajahn, I think, asked him about his opinion on that. He's like, oh, I heard that you didn't like blank blank that much. And this monastic was sort of like, did I ever tell you about this statue that we're walking past? And Ajahn was like, oh, really? And, so there's a place for that. So yeah, you don't want to do it too much, and you've got to just watch your intention. But we never lie. I mean, that's the basis, is that you could just lock in, because there's a place for that, And yeah, everything else, absolutely, you've got to notice when you're beginning to bend things, and you don't want to manipulate people. So I hope that answers stuff a bit. Yeah, so the question was a bit on if, that the talk began and ended with the political polarization, and just the questioner noting how it's become really intense recently, and there's a huge amount of selfing there, and marriages have been breaking up, and friendships and families. I think a lot of it comes down to what, I was speaking about in terms of knowing the higher order connection. And when our existence has no fulcrum save the self, then how can we not cling to it? And I think so much of the political polarization is because every canopy of meaning our society has been slowly getting shredded. Spiritual community, spiritual path, location and place, role, any clear concept of the future. So much of these things have been sort of undermined. And so when every one of those sort of stabilizing influences leaves, then people cling very tightly to what they have. And ideologies are crippled religions. They limp along. They provide a sense of meaning and cohesiveness. They provide a sense of evil and good and purpose, but it's a shallow and crippled version and doesn't acknowledge the depth of the human heart. And a true tragedy is seeing these profound impulses of people, the religious impulse, because the only language which is appropriate to that deepest impulse in someone is the religious language, in terms of transcendence, purity, love. But when that gets if it has no vessel to go into except for a political ideology, I mean, it's all people have, so you sort of pour it in there. But it's a little like how the Marvel movies have become so popular. We've lost our gods, so we have Iron Man. I'm not being trite, you look at the lineup of movies, it's superhero movies. People, but what a terrible replacement. I mean, and so yeah, I think, and that's the beauty also of seeing how you don't have to necessarily go on a crusade to convince the rest of society about your views. But if you provide them with a canopy of meaning, again, and that's the beauty of the Four Noble Truths, is it's a palatable, unbelievably effective canopy of meaning. This is how we approach our lives. This is how we find purpose. This is how we confront suffering. This is how we connect. Then all the attraction and seduction of a political ideology ceases to grab us in the same way. So that can be our role. We help a lot just by practicing. And it's not like there's not a place for those political discussions, but they can't hold that deepest impulse of the heart, and they become contorted when they try. you see like very wholesome movements become infused with a religious fervor which transforms them from these beautiful things into something problematic. So yeah, I see it too. And what we can do is we can practice and speak to people about what matters to them most and connect on those levels. People have enough people to debate politics with. You don't have to, like, they don't have enough people to talk Dhamma with. That's what they're lacking. So, yeah, so 2 questions or thoughts. One was on the desire to sort of embody this practice's admonition towards service and looking for ways to do that. Yeah, I think that's one of the beauties of having a monastery and a community is like it gives a place for that service to manifest very powerfully and potently. I mean, it's something I was so hungry for, and it's sort of what we're hoping to do here as well. And yeah, apart from sort of finding various volunteer things, give me an email, and I really would love to see various. There's not much, we're still a budding community, but there are things that can be done and helped out with, and one of those would be, great. I know there's a lot of people here who, are very dedicated to this path and probably would be interested in meeting at least one other time a week or every now and again, and it'd be interesting to see if, there's any potential for organizing something like that. Anyways, yeah, but finding something that hits the spot in that way is, that is important, I understand. I think little things can go a long way, like the practice of, of not eating before you've given. I think that applies better to dinner. But, I think just taking that on as a daily practice and giving some food every day somehow, it's like, that's a pretty amazing practice. That will change your life in the course of a month. Yeah, but I sympathize. Yeah. And yeah, if people have volunteer venues and routes that they approach and use, then perhaps you can speak with them. And Lacey, as to the question was around skillful speech that's roundabout, like I experienced in Thailand, versus when people use that as a means of bypassing important conversation, and it can be perceived as kind of cowardly, and it can be. Yeah, I actually agree. I tend more towards direct conversation. I think in our culture it's appropriate a lot. But I'd say, becoming really skilled at that, and so often it's like, especially if you're with someone who's mindful-ish, just being quiet and letting the bad act kind of ring. Usually they'll catch themselves to some extent, but then yeah, like finding, usually then with conflicts I've had is there does come that moment where you do find the right time for the conversation, and I think in that context it's just the admonition, the conditions for admonition that the Buddha lays down for monks are so helpful. So before a monk admonishes another monk, we have to meet 5 conditions. We have to ask permission, they have to give it. We have to be free from fault ourselves. We have to speak truthfully. We have to speak with a mind of loving kindness. And we have to pick the right time and place. So, monasteries are full of stories of monks admonishing themselves before the daily meal. It never goes well, or rarely. And I know Ajahn Amaro, in order for, say, one admonition he was hoping to give towards a monk, he just couldn't summon that mind of loving kindness, and he waited a year. That's a bit much, but you notice how even the slightest bit of anger and trying to vent changes everything in the conversation. People sense it. So I think there's really a place for that just puts such constraints on it. It's so helpful, because then you do approach the conversation at the right time, and yeah, that's my preferred method as well. Yeah.